The important thing here is very simple. When you're doing a story and you're presented, if we have a breaking news story tomorrow in Kiev that affects the business community, some of you will be competing on that story. Because we've got Kiev Post and Kommersant and what have you. And they'll both be saying, oh, I've got to go cover this story. How creatively you bring it, you're not allowed to go off and get crazy creative necessarily, but what's the approach going to be? How are you going to treat the story? What are you going to remember to do? What can you do with the story? Well, the answer is, if you're creatively dull, there's a very good chance that you and the competition will basically write the same story. Now, let me explain how this plays out, say, for me and my work, because it has a very personal thing for me. I write currently 2 columns a week, and I write them basically at the end of the week. But when I write them, it's irrelevant because I don't write them based on when news breaks. Occasionally, something will happen, and I'll say, you need me to write a column, I'll bang one out on that. But what's much more likely to happen is Detroit goes bankrupt, right? Happened in the United States about 10 days ago. Detroit goes bankrupt, and I'm going to wind up writing something about longer-term impacts, and I'm going to wind up writing about what we wind up seeing for the mutual fund industry. In fact, I wrote each of those columns. But I wrote them on my time schedule, which is Detroit basically went bankrupt on one Friday, and I was writing for the following Friday. If I am creatively dull, if all I do is the kind of thing that everybody else can do, even if I pay no attention to what everybody else is writing, and I try very hard to pay no attention to anyone else, if I'm working on a piece, I don't really want to know what somebody else has said. If I'm creatively dull, I'm going to look like I copied them. I can't help it. In fact, if they're dull and I'm dull, they're going to basically be able to say, he copied me, and although I didn't, and I promise you I don't look at their stuff, I won't have much choice but to at least look like it, right? So I can't afford to be creatively dull. If I can't do better than the other guy or come up with something more creative or different, I shouldn't write it. Right? And that's actually a standard that we use. Sometimes it will be breaking news, and I'll go, I need to write this right now. And the answer is, that's because I can't put my usual spin on what this means and find another way. So, for example, in the Detroit bankruptcy, it happens that 30 years ago I worked in Detroit. And we sat around, and it's a true story, and in fact I got an email from one of the guys. It was great to hear from him. We sat around in the newsroom arguing over who would go bankrupt first, Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, or the city of Detroit. It was 1984. And I can tell you, I was a freshly minted economics major from the University of Michigan, and I knew exactly who was going to go bankrupt of those 4. All of them were going to go bankrupt. Okay? Because in 1984, we got to a spot where I had gotten to write a column, or not a column, a story that talked about how at that particular point, 49% of the price of a Ford, but 50% of the price of a GM car went to pay for the health care of the workers who built it. And if you're building cars, but the cost that you're charging somebody is paying for their health care, eventually you're probably going to go out of business. And indeed, that's pretty much what happened until they got restructured, et cetera. It just took a little longer. But pretty interesting, because I can tell you, we sat around and had those discussions, and you could see it coming. Well, if you could see it coming when Detroit goes bankrupt, you have to find another way to write about it. You come in and you say, look, this has been visible for 30 years. Now go ahead and take a look at every other city in America that's got problems and go, how visible are their problems and how likely is this to happen to you? And remember that 30 years ago in Detroit, everyone else said we were nutty to even think about it. Right? The more you take your approach to different places, the more you get to control your message. But to do that, they talk about thinking outside the box. The ideas of dullards, creative dullards, those are the box ideas. You want to throw the box away. It's not about thinking outside the box. It's about what can I do to make my work better. I want to tell great stories. That's what I want. If I tell great stories, it doesn't make a difference. If I can find a way to tell a story that has numbers in it, right? But I tell it well enough, you can take the most boring subject and get somebody to read it. Case in point. Many years ago, for reasons that I still think escape me, I decided one week that I needed to write a story about dairy price supports in the United States. Now, I'm sure you do not know what dairy price supports are, but functionally it was a government program that was designed to try to help farmers who might be losing money by sort of artificially keeping the price of milk at a certain level. Okay? So think a government program. You have government programs here. This was ours for dairy farmers. The price of milk in the United States at that time was set entirely on the basis of something that I'm sure makes perfect sense to somebody. It was, how many miles are you from Eau Claire, Wisconsin? From what I can understand, it would sort of be, I know that one of my great-grandfathers lived in Preluki. It would be like saying, hey, we'll make a decision for Ukraine on a gas tax based on how far you live from Preluki. It doesn't really make... Eau Claire, Wisconsin is a town of about 30,000 people in the middle of dairy country. They decided it was the middle of the belt that produces the most milk and whatever, and so the way they structured this was, how far are you from this little town that nobody'd ever heard of and nobody ever been to and nobody really cared about, but oh, by the way, when you went to the grocery store, here's the price of milk. And it's entirely based on the fact that you can't move where you live closer to Eau Claire, Wisconsin. So I write a story that uses that tie as a lead-in an interesting way. And I go to the gym the following Monday, and the gym manager is a friend of mine, and he greets me and goes, I cannot believe you did that. And I'm like, what are you talking about? He goes, you got me to spend 5 minutes of my Sunday reading about damned dairy price supports. And I'm like, so? He goes, so nobody would ever want to spend 5 minutes of their life reading about dairy price supports. And it was only when I finished the story that I realized, oh my God, I just spent 5 minutes about this thing that is so complicated and that I would never read about. But a good headline and a good story, and suddenly it's not complicated. You guys have spent a lot of time talking about how involved the business stories are and how complicated they have to be. To reach real people, you need to be as ordinary as possible. You need to find a story and tell them. And you need to stop putting limits on yourself that say, I can't write this way because. There are no limits to your writing. There are only limits to what your editors will tolerate. And if you tell great stories, your editors will tolerate almost anything. But you have to figure it out. To let yourself write great stories, you have to come outside the box. Thanks again for putting up with me for the last couple of days. I appreciate it. And again, happy to give you my card, help you out if I can, all those other good things.